those watching remotely on Facebook. I had a thought this morning. Deb, did we tell our anti-piracy team to scale up to make sure that this wasn't being pirated?
No one wants to stream you, don't worry.
No? Really? I kind of imagine like a bunch of millennials sitting around the table going, ooh, GDPR, Statton going to talk to us about GDPR. I'd love to see them kind of the stream on that, the illegal piracy stream. So, look folks, this is a big topic. It's going to impact every industry and every market you can think of. But we're not going to tackle everything today. We're going to just bite off a chunk. The chunk that I think is most relevant for this room, which is how are we going to do IP enforcement when we're not going to see the WHOIS data that we'll rely upon now to find where the bad guys are. So here's a quick agenda where we're going. Quick overview, one slide on what GDPR is, because I'm going to assume that most of you, if you don't have at least a good understanding, at least have heard about it, and you know it's coming. We're going to talk about ICANN's interim model. That ICANN, again, is the Internet Corporation of Assigned Names and Numbers. It is the organization tasked with the security and the stability of the domain name system. The model that they were proposing and the Article 29 working party's response to that model. What this all means in terms of IP enforcement going forward and brand protection efforts. We're going to talk about what MarkMonitor is currently doing to sort of prepare for this and mitigate the impacts. And then I'll take your questions. So I'm going to blow through these slides as quickly as I can, so I'll leave lots of room, lots of time for questions. Andrew, are you ready?
I'm ready.
Okay. GDPR, European General Data Protection Regulation, okay? It's a complex privacy law. The purpose of the law was to harmonize privacy across Europe. So I compare the Europeans' obsession with privacy to Americans' obsession over the Second Amendment and the right to bear arms. It is something that is integrally cultural to Europeans. They value their privacy. The enforcement of the GDPR begins in 30 days, roughly. It hasn't actually been in effect since 2016, but the enforcement is going to begin very, very soon. It applies to data subjects that reside in the European Union. It applies only to personal data of natural persons, not to legal entities like corporations. And it governs the collection, retention, and processing of that data, and prescribes that in order for you to do such collection and processing, it must be adequate, relevant, and limited in its purpose, and often done with the consent of the person who is providing their data. And why is this really important? Because if there is a violation of the GDPR, the statutory damages and stiff fines and penalties are massive. It's 20 million euros per violation, or could be up to 4% of your revenue. Right? That gets a lot of people's attention. Right? So people are scrambling to figure out how they can comply with the GDPR. But how does this impact what we're doing here in this room? Well, the GDPR forces the domain name registrars to re-examine their data collection requirements. So a domain name registrar is the company that sells you the domain name, of course. They're required by ICANN, their contract with ICANN called the RAA, the Registrar Accreditation Agreement, to collect personal information about every registrar of the domain name and to make that public. So your email address, your name, your mailing address, zip code, phone number, administrative contact, billing contact information, all of that is currently being collected by your registrar when you register a domain name. The legal opinions, all of which I've seen, have concluded that the current WHOIS publication of that data is not going to be compliant with GDPR. Not surprisingly, because if you are a natural person residing in the EU and you submit your personal information to your registrar to register a domain name, that's going to be detected and under the regulation, and therefore WHOIS should not display that publicly. So ICANN announced reinforcement of the requirement for registrars to publish the WHOIS data if they came up with a model which they thought was GDPR compliant, what the WHOIS should look like. And they also, made a representation that they would comply with the RAA in all other respects. So that's what happened. The registrars and the community of stakeholders at ICANN started working on what they called an interim model for WHOIS. They called it the interim model because there's actually a working group at ICANN that has the task of putting together what the next generation of the WHOIS data will look like going forward. So until that policy working group finishes its work, you have to put something in place for May 25th. At least that was the idea. So ICANN gathered inputs from all the different stakeholders in the domain name industry, and they came up with this model. And I'll just run through it really quickly. First of all, their registrars are still going to collect all of the data that they have always collected. We call that the full thick WHOIS data that has all of the registrant information, the email address, the contact information, all of that stuff. And that transfer of data will be transmitted to the registries, which they're required to do under the contract, and to the escrow provider. And the retention of that will be for 2 years. Here's the tricky part, though. The registrars said, well, okay, we'll do that, but we're not going to validate whether you're a natural person or you're residing in the EU. For them, remember, domain names are a very small margin business, right? So any activity and work that you have to put into validating a customer is an increased cost to every registrar, including the big registrars like GoDaddy and others, right? So registrars resisted that. And ICANN said, okay, you can apply this model globally, which means it doesn't matter if it's a natural person or a legal entity. It doesn't matter if you're residing in the EU or not. All WHOIS data will have to fit into this model. So, will the registrant name be in public WHOIS? No, it won't under this model. Only a registrant organization. Postal address? No, only the state, province, and country will be available, okay, under this model. So, and the reason why that information is public is because if you're going to do any kind of enforcement work, you need to know which jurisdiction you're in, right? So at least you'll know where the domain name registrant is in terms of his location. Email address? No, not any longer. Though the registrars are encouraged to create an anonymous email address that you can relay a message to the actual registrant. No phone, no fax number, no immediate contact, except for an anonymized email. So you can see the registrant contact information is heavily redacted. And the last element is that there be a provision for an accreditation or access to the full WHOIS data. So that means if you have a legitimate public interest or purpose, a stated purpose for seeing that full WHOIS data, you have to be accredited and given access to that, which, of course, that's of the most importance to us. As brand protection, doing brand protection work, because if we can access the full WHOIS data, okay, well then we can do our enforcement work. So the accreditation access model started to become developed as well. Now this wasn't developed really with all the multi-stakeholders initially. It was really generated from a bunch of companies and public safety organizations and legal experts and cybersecurity firms who do all of these abuse enforcements all day long and know the importance of this WHOIS data. So MarkMonitor was part of that effort as we came up with a list of who these eligible entities would be that might want to seek and use this data, what the legitimate and lawful purposes are, how you can be accredited to look at the WHOIS data, the full WHOIS data. there was a detailed purpose statement because the GDPR requires that if you're going to access this data that's protected, you have to have a very specific purpose for that data. And then we proposed an operating model and terms and of accreditation and how that would be. So this was a collaborative effort, as everything that happens in the domain name industry and the domain name policy network. And so I can package this all up, get into the real gut punch here, package this all up, and they brought it to the Article 29 Working Party, which is a European advisory body that's comprised of data protection authorities, academics, researchers, enforcement folks, etc. And they asked them, and I can ask the Article 29 Working Party, well, how do you like our model? Do you think it complies? Well, they got an answer. The answer was, needs more work. I don't think, they said essentially, we don't think you have enough meat on the bones. There are not enough details regarding your specific purposes, the use of the non-public WHOIS data. And furthermore, your request that we have that we implement a moratorium on enforcement come May 25th? No, we're not going to grant you that either. So, I came back to the community and said, well, this is what they said, and we're not really sure what to do next. But here's the gut punch. Without a model that's been approved by the ICANN community, including registries and registrars, those who publish who it is, without a model that the Article 29 Working Party has sort of signed off on and said, this looks good, implement it, and without the time to actually implement this model, what is going to happen to WHOIS? On May 25th, it's likely to go off. That is, it's going to go dark with respect to all of the data related to the registrar. Now, there'll still be data in WHOIS. Registrar data, registrar ID, abuse contact information for the registrar, some of those things that are not specific to the registrant, that data will still be seen. So it's not like you won't see anything there, but you won't see any registrant data. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, like I said, only what we call now thin WHOIS data is actually going to be made available. That's just the registrar information, the technical pieces around the domain, creation date, and that sort of thing. There's no method of directly communicating with the registrant. There's not even an anonymous email address required. Okay, again, there is no model, right? Even though all this work went into it, there is no official model. Does that mean registrars and registries can create an anonymous email address? Sure, and some may, but there's no requirements to it. And registrars generally take the path of least resistance, right? They're not going to do something that they're not required to do. Again, it's a lot of work, and it's a lot of cost. So how are you going to have to enforce? Well, you can send notices to the registrar abuse contact, and of course that's now going to be a flooded email box full of notices because there's no way to send it actually to the actual registrar. Legal actions are going to be required. We're going to have to enlist the likes of Doug over here and Mark Trachtenberg in the back, our trademark and IP lawyers who can spend now more of their billable time filing subpoenas and court orders in order to see the underlying WHOIS. So it's going to be a lot more cost. There's no bulk WHOIS access. There's no the effectiveness of reverse WHOIS lookup services. That's when we look at different fields in WHOIS and try to find and scan WHOIS to find those similar data points in other WHOIS records. So like nail the bad guys, right? Find out if they're using the same IP address or the same, the same kind of data. Anonymous domain name acquisitions and transfers, obviously more difficult to complete. If you want to go out and buy a domain name, who are you buying it from? you don't know. You can't make an offer to somebody you don't know who owns the domain name. So I don't know how it's going to affect the aftermarket. You know, domain names are a commodity; they're bought and sold all the time, but you don't know who the registrar is. There's going to be more manual processes that are going to be required to look at websites, find any kind of contact data at all, because you're not going to have a WHOIS record that you can rely on. And technology will be critically important. There is technology out there that looks at metadata behind websites, that scans websites for information that you might be able to use to do enforcement. And you'll have to rely on other databases in order to get this information. Write to your Secretary of State or go online, see if there are any corporate records related to, a name that's part of the domain name. I mean, it's going to be difficult. It's going to be difficult. Can't sugarcoat this enough. So that's where we are. So what's going to happen in 30 days? Well, at MarkMonitor, we're working hard to continue our advocacy work to try to get an accreditation access model in place as soon as we can. I can tell you it will not be done in 30 days, but we are working hard to refine that model, the interim model, the accreditation and access model, so that we can get registries and registrars all on the same page and adopting something soon. We're also looking at our own compliance and our own enforcement work and the enforcement efforts that we do on your behalf. As I said, without WHOIS, a lot of the information that we use to do enforcement will not be there for us to do. So how do we do enforcement in a post-GDPR black WHOIS era? Well, the first thing we're doing for our own compliance is scrubbing the WHOIS database to make sure that our client WHOIS is not containing any personal information. Now, as I said, GDPR doesn't apply to legal entities. Most of our clients, maybe all of them, are corporate entities or corporate domain name registrars. So, from one standpoint, it doesn't make any difference to us as impact as a registrar, because we don't have personal data, except sometimes you have an email address from one of your colleagues at work that you use in the WHOIS record, and that might qualify as personal information. So we have to scrub out all the information to make sure that there's no personal data that's going to be published. We're developing mitigation strategies for all of our lines of business. So weeks ago, we did a GDPR impact analysis where we went to every single service that we provide, and we identified, does it use WHOIS? If so, what information does it use? How will it be impacted? So we did an assessment of all of that, and then from that, we started brainstorming what techniques, what technology, what manual work, what training do we need to give our CSMs and brand analysts to prepare and do enforcements. We're also consulting with our European Legal Counsel on efforts and options to maintain the current WHOIS. As I said, this relates to sort of our advocacy work, and same with the next bullet point there. We're still advocating for an open and accessible WHOIS, even post-GDPR enforcement. Optimistic that we're going to get there, but we're never say die when you're doing policy advocacy work. We're meeting with the registry operators and registrars to understand exactly what changes they're going to make to their WHOIS. As I mentioned, without a model, registrars, it's like free-for-all. They can shut the WHOIS off, or they can leave certain things up. And each registrar is starting to push out, each registry and registrar is starting to push out publicly, look, this is what our WHOIS is going to look like, post-enforcement. We're expanding our current scanning technology, and I mentioned this before, the technology that we can utilize and deploy that helps look at metadata behind websites and see if there's any contact information. Is there an email address? Is there a phone number? Is there, anything like that that we can use to, grab onto and send an enforcement notice? Now, most of you are thinking, well, bad guys, they don't put their real stuff on their website. You'd be surprised, actually, that there is something there that you can communicate with them often than not. In some of the testing that we did, we looked at sampling of 150 links and see if in those 150 links there was enough data to send an enforcement without relying on WHOIS. And in 80% of the cases, we were able to identify some information there. Again, quality of it, I'm not sure yet. We'll have to see when we start doing enforcements that way. But it can be one data point, and one data point next to another data point next to another data point, can get us maybe enough to identify the registrar. We're exploring the engagement of third-party data resources. And as I mentioned, we're also preparing to train our CSMs and the brand analysts to do enforcement as if the registrant information were covered by a privacy or proxy service, which we do today, actually. You guys are familiar with privacy proxy services. Registrants can mask their WHOIS data now by paying a subscription fee to the registrar. And we've been doing enforcements that way for a long time. So it's not terribly new, but now the scale of it is going to be greater, right? Because there's not a WHOIS record. So that's where we are at MarkMonitor. And, there's a team that's cross-functioning at the company to, work on this problem. We've got engineering, we've got policy, we've got relationship managers, we've got the CSMs and each of the brand analysts, all working to brainstorm some ideas as well, which is what's happening all over the industry, right? So everybody's trying to think, okay, how do I do enforcement? How do I do enforcement? How do I do enforcement post GDPR? So here's our advice, and then I'll open it for questions. If you're doing a lot of brand enforcement in-house, then you need to prepare your internal teams for having to do it manually. What does that mean? That means instead of looking at the WHOIS record, you're going to have to look at the website and you're going to have to dig through and see if you can find some contact information. The other thing you can do, which is probably the first thing, as I mentioned previously, is send communications to the abuse contact at the registrar, because you will know who the registrar is, and you will have an abuse email contact. So send a notice there. You'll have to prepare your legal counsel to file subpoenas and get court orders to look at the WHOIS if the registry is not able to provide it. Some registries may decide, well, okay, I'll give you access under certain conditions. So you might have to go through that process. How do I get access to the full WHOIS at this registrar or this registry? Recommend that you look at a third-party provider or ask MarkMonitor to do those scans for you, to do the technology scan, to see if there is information that we can glean from other data sources. Speaking of other data sources, using other information in the DNS, such as IP addresses, name server data, to do the triangulation of data points to find out who the perpetrators are. And one of the things I would highly encourage you is let me know if you are interested in becoming in doing some advocacy, and along with me to push ICANN to implement an accreditation and access model as soon as possible. What does that mean? Well, it's going to be months. It's going to take months in order to get that fully baked and get it implemented by registries and registrars. It's going to take some time, but time is of the essence. The May 25th deadline is real. We don't anticipate that on May 26th there'll be data protection authorities, those who are enlisted or tasked with doing enforcement, going to be knocking on, registrar doors. I don't see that kind of enforcement happening immediately. But time is of the essence. The sooner we get a model up, and the sooner we can get folks in this room accredited and given access to the full WHOIS, the sooner we can maintain the level of enforcement that we come to rely on. Pretty good. Went through that pretty quickly, I guess. I have about 5 minutes for questions, so let's have it. We'll start over here, go right to left.
You had mentioned that anonymous domain name acquisitions would be more difficult. Is there any reason why non-anonymous domain name acquisitions wouldn't be equally difficult?
The question was on anonymous acquisitions. If they weren't anonymous. So let me explain what I meant by anonymous acquisition. That's a service that we provide, also MarkMonitor, where we'll go out and buy a domain name for you without revealing that it's you that wants to actually own the name. So we do it as a surrogate. So when I say anonymous, I mean we're doing it on your behalf so that you remain anonymous, but we aren't. But when we do that, we have to go look at the WHOIS data to see who owns the domain name so we can make an offer on your behalf. That obviously will be more difficult to do if we can't identify who the domain name owner is. Okay.
Does the GDPR attempt to address collecting the data currently available up to May 24 and then actually acting on that data on May 26?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the jury's still out, to use the expression, right? Because we don't know. The GDPR says any information that you collect, even if you collect it before May 25th, is still subject to GDPR. But if it was made available and made public at some point, there's obviously an argument that it's already been out there, and so enforcement on something like that shouldn't really be of highest concern to the data protection authorities because that was already made public. But the language applies even retroactively to data. Any other questions? Yes.
Actually, I have 2 questions.
Wait, Mike for a second. That's for the Facebook posts.
Thank you. All right. So 2 questions really. Number 1 is, I understand that you all are working to try to get better, to get registrar type access to the information, and the actual model they work out for even interim access for stakeholders will be longer down the road. Have you guys thought about sort of how you're going to provide that as in your pricing? It's not a subpoena, obviously, it's just you guys using the registrar access theoretically, and therefore, if we need to find out who somebody is to take down notice, theoretically, that registrar access might give you greater access than we have. That's the first part of the question. The second part of the question is, there are programs out there like Multigo, which I think is made out of Australia, that have the ability to gather a lot of other information with those. It's an investigative tool. If you don't know those, you'll be able to pull in all information of those being sort of neutered as well.
Yeah. I'll answer the second part first. Okay. So as I mentioned, we're looking at other data sources and other technologies that can do that. So I'm not familiar with that particular company, but that's the kind of effort we're undertaking. Is there some other data out there that, by the way, also has to be collected GDPR compliantly, that we might be able to use? I was at the RSA, the security conference, just last week in San Francisco, and I was talking to some folks that do all kinds of DNS scanning, and there's all bits and bytes of information that people gather and harvest, and then you have to obviously do your own analysis on it, but some of that information might be useful too. IP addresses and domains and hashes and all of this stuff. You can, if you knew what to search for in that massive data, if you were looking for anything that has Nissan in it, that data might be able to tell you some commonalities of who's doing the counterfeiting or something. On your first question, about working with registrars. I think I understand it is, are you talking to the registrars to see if we could get access as an accredited user? The answer is yes, but I have to admit that most of the registrars are thinking, well, let's see what happens, right? I mean, we've got 30 days and they're all making their own decisions, right? So they've been pretty non-committal about giving us whitelisted access to any part of their WHOIS data, which we currently have for some registrars. Some CCTLD operators, though, who've been masking WHOIS for years. They're saying, yeah, we have an accreditation and access model, you know, and so we will be certainly participating in whatever that is going forward, you know, and hope to get accredited. Yes.
So I'm wondering how it's going to work. Recently, the only course of action for like roads and big websites are inbound this.
Yep.
So I guess the question is,
Are you worse shape than under that circumstance? Is that what you're saying? Yeah.
well, what's the history or how we're going around that? That's really, as of now, it's the only way, at least from my standpoint, how we've been able to get the big websites down to file about with the registrar.
Right, so IP compliance forces invalid WHOIS data, but how do you know if it's valid or not? I don't know.
How is that?
I don't know.
On the other end as well. So, you won't be able to see it, first of all, even make a complaint, and then even on the other side, the registrar.
Right. So we talked about that actually in the little tiger team that we have at MarkMonitor, and you know, what we would do is probably send if we suspect that the website doesn't have the right credentials. If we know it's a fraud site, for example, we might send an abuse in there and say, check the WHOIS. So they have to go through the whole process of contacting the registrant, asking them to validate their WHOIS, even though we haven't seen it, right? We just want a hunch, right? And you know, see what kind of response comes back from the registrar. That's why I said the registrar is going to get flooded with abuse notices, because there's not another place to go to send. There's no registrant contact to send the enforcement notice to, which you would normally do. Great, now we can have lunch. Thank you all very much. I'm happy to take more questions at lunch or any topic.